Let's change the scenario a bit. For some reason, you do not give the earnest money check to your principal broker until 5 days after you receive it. The check subsequently bounces. Is this situation any different than the one previously discussed? Since you did not meet the 4-day requirement, you or your principal broker may be responsible for the earnest money deposit. This means you or your principal broker may need to come up with the earnest money deposit the seller thought you had deposited on time. What if your buyer tells you the earnest money check will not clear the bank when they give it to you? What should you do? You should not create a contract which says the buyer is presenting an earnest money deposit. To do so would constitute misrepresentation to the seller. Let's assume your buyer is from out of town and they forgot their checkbook. They need to mail you a check once they return home. May you still write up an offer? The answer is yes, but you need to make sure the seller understands what is happening. The rules we have discussed are the basic requirements set forth in statute and rules. If the buyers and sellers wish to agree to something differently, it is their option to do so. The key being that both parties agree to the change and they agree in writing. In our example with the out-of-town buyer, you, as their agent, would simply need to write in the contract that you do not have the earnest money. You would also need to state when you will receive the earnest money and when it will be deposited. Let's assume your buyer does not want their earnest money deposited in the brokerage real estate trust account. They would like the earnest money deposited at a title company. Is that acceptable? The answer is yes, as long as both parties agree to the change and they agree to it in writing. The written agreement to the change is usually part of the purchase contract. What if the seller wants to hold the earnest money themselves? In other words, the seller wants the buyer to write out an earnest money check directly to the seller rather than to the brokerage representing the buyer. Would this be allowed under the rules? This would be allowed as long as both the buyer and seller agree to the change in writing. However, a buyer may not be comfortable with the seller holding the earnest money because it may prove difficult to get the deposit returned if the situation ever arises. Would it be acceptable for a buyer to present an offer which did not include any earnest money at all? Yes. There is not a requirement that all purchase contracts include earnest money deposits. The seller may not accept the offer without an earnest money deposit, but it is not against the rules or statute. Promissory notes. If a buyer does not have any money for an earnest money deposit, another option exists other than writing a contract without any deposit at all. Without any deposit at all. The buyer could promise to pay earnest money if it becomes necessary. In this case, the borrower actually would sign a promissory note. The beneficiary or payee of the earnest money promissory note should always be the seller. In the note, the buyer is promising to pay the seller earnest money in the case that the buyer defaults on the contract. The actual note itself is kept by the principal broker on the transaction, usually in the transaction file. The purchase contract must specify that the earnest money is in the form of a promissory note, and all parties must agree to the promissory note. Builder's deposits. An important distinction exists between a construction or builder's deposit and an earnest money deposit. As we have discussed, earnest money deposits are to be placed in the principal broker's real estate trust account. The money remains in the trust account until the transaction closes or fails. Construction or builder deposits are different. A construction deposit is often required by a builder who has contracted with a buyer to build a new home for the buyer. Construction deposits are often paid directly to the builder. The builder then uses the construction deposit to partially fund the construction of the home. In the event of a dispute or breach of contract between the builder and the buyer during the construction process, the construction deposit is most likely not available to be refunded to the buyer. The builder has most likely spent the construction deposit in constructing the home. However, if the buyer put down money as an earnest money deposit rather than a construction deposit, the money remains in the principal broker's trust account and is available for refund or other disposition if a problem arises. Deposits paid by a buyer in connection with a new construction transaction may either be earnest money or construction deposits. The purchase contract should clearly identify which part of a deposit is considered earnest money and which part of the deposit is considered a construction deposit. Earnest money is held by the broker, and construction deposits are remitted directly to the builder. It is possible to have an earnest money deposit changed into a construction deposit. For example, the builder may require a $10,000 earnest money deposit, but require that the deposited earnest money be turned into a construction deposit once the home is framed. In this case, the $10,000 would initially be deposited in the principal broker's trust account. When the time came for the deposit to change into a construction deposit, the principal broker would remit the funds to the builder to be used as a construction deposit. Again, all these details must be identified in the contract.